Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night to everyone in our virtual space. The Association of the Land Economy and Valuation Surveyors welcomes you to our first webinar for 2023 under the topic Development versus environment, two sides of a single coin, incorporating the environmental, social, and governance framework into the Caribbean real estate landscape. This webinar is brought to you by ALEVS and is made possible by our sponsors. Special thanks to our sponsors, Lucy Caribbean, Alison Peter and Associates, A.S. James and Associates, Easton Douglas Consultants Limited, Oikos Property Services, Task Property Appraisals, Oron Real Estate and Valuations Company Limited, KB Realty, SFR Realty, JCI Property Services, and Nevi Property Services. There are some things that we need to bear in mind, take into consideration this webinar. You will notice that all mics are muted and cameras are turned off. This is intentional to keep the focus of our speakers. Please feel free to reach out to any of our administrators, write in the chat if you are experiencing ongoing technical issues, but please note our capacity to address each issue while the webinar is running is limited. We are recording the webinar and streaming it live to a private YouTube chat feed and may upload to our website public channel in the future. We are offering a live caption feature on all our webinars. You can access this feature by clicking on caption at the bottom of your screen. Screenshots will be taken during the session today. If you prefer to have your screens excluded from any product we may create, please send us an email to alevs_jamaica@hotmail.com with the request indicating what's on your screen, your Zoom name, etc. Please be present and engage in our webinar opportunities such as live polls and surveys. A survey will pop up at the end of the webinar. Please be respectful of others by behaving and communicating professionally. Questions will be answered during the question and answer session. And please feel free to type as they come up. During the Q&A section, you may also raise your hand for verbal questions. You will be acknowledged and given the opportunity to unmute and speak. Please use respectful language in addressing participants and presenters. All registrants will receive an email with a link to some files that will be used up to 5 days post the event. Please download them as you wish. So this webinar, ALEVS, just to let you know about ALEVS, the Association of Land Economy and Valuation Surveyors, we were established in 1974 as a body engaging professionals who are referred to as estate managers, land administrators, land economy surveyors, valuation surveyors, real estate appraisers, in general practice and general practice surveyors. We have contributed significantly over the years to our individual members, and as a whole, our contribution includes contributions to the Real Estate Dealers and Developers Act, and later developing the diploma and bachelor's program in land economy and valuation surveying at the University of Technology. This year, ALEVS proudly celebrates 49 years. With it, a track record of professionalism in Jamaica with a noted network of over 100 members and valuation supporters. We eagerly look forward to another 49 years of legacy building, and we welcome all to our webinar registrants. A background to our webinar: as Caribbean public and private sector built environment actors and stakeholders become active players in global marketplace, there has been a growing need for the demonstrable inclusion of environmental, social, and governance ESG considerations in our day-to-day operations. It has been established that treating issues pertaining to real estate development and management and the environment separately gives rise to exclusionary outcomes, making it the rationale for seeing them as two sides of a single coin clear. Firstly, whether conceptualized from the environmental or place-making perspective, an environment ought to be inclusionary, space. And secondly, developments or the act of developing must be embedded with a focus on inclusivity at all levels. In fact, one may even argue that where developments are exclusionary, sustainability is unattainable. Guided by this view, it is apparent that in accomplishing sustainability, the tension and interconnectivity among climate change, development, economic growth, poverty eradication, and institutional and organizational reform must be tackled in theory and in practice. It is also evident that the opposing development trajectories of the developed North and global South collectively reinforce the manifold nature of the development-environment relationship. It is also clear that the environment lends its natural resources to those wishing to achieve economic growth and simultaneously may be forced to accept waste, which adversely affects the livelihoods of people and community. This is an extract from SHA 2021. This webinar will address local challenges and opportunities through the lens of ESG framework and facilitate discussion on how the impending ESG regulatory framework requirements can be supported locally. In this webinar, the potential for changes that facilitate the pursuance of sustainability and ESG goals will be explored under four topics. One, unpacking global ESG standards and sustainable development goals, their interlinkages with real estate performance on a global scale, and the challenges faced at that level. Two, examining the possible effects of ESG considerations on market performance, risk management, and sustainable development in Caribbean markets through various cases. Offering suggestions on how the ESG framework can be practically incorporated in real estate, market policies and regulations, valuations, and business operations. For facilitating reflective discourse on opportunities and challenges that can be explored in the Caribbean public and private sector real estate stakeholders. This webinar was structured such that it uses multimodal presentations, collaborative inquiry, and critical reflection will be coalesced to create an enlivening and innovative attendee-centered learning space. To this end, the webinar will consist of 3 segments. Segment 1, entitled Global ESG Landscape and Opportunities and Challenges for the Caribbean, addresses the first 2 objectives and will shed light on the state of ESG in the real estate market globally, the provisions to move forward global regulatory standard, and the benefits derived in real estate asset performance. It will use a comparative approach in assessing the ways in which the gaps between the planning and legal structure regimes and real estate markets might present themselves in the performance of real estate markets, the assessment and management of risk, and the attainment of sustainable development goals. Segment 2 incorporating ESG framework practically addresses objectives 3 and 4 using a structured discussion and a reflective exercise to draw on the collective professional experience and expertise of the panelists to structure an organic narrative on the practical promotion of environment, sustainability, and sustainable development in the Caribbean real estate market policy. At this time, I'll be introducing our panelists, Mr. Andrew Miller and Ms. Kadian Arthur-Spino. Mr. Miller is an agricultural economist and appraiser and the principal director of Channel Miller and Associates Property Services. Andrew has over 12 years experience in appraisal and real estate, acquired through his current role and previous responsibility with 2 valuation firms in Jamaica. He holds a BSc in Land Economy and Valuation Surveying honors from the University of Technology, Jamaica, and an MSc Agribusiness from Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University, FAMU. His qualification in agribusiness has equipped him to be adept in appraising agricultural properties. His research interests include adoption of new technologies in agriculture and climate settings in African Caribbean countries. Ms. Kadian Arthur-Spino is an ALEVS member, CIC Council member, and IFMA member. Kadian is a graduate of the University of Technology, Jamaica, with a bachelor's degree in Land Economy and Valuation Surveying. She has garnered technical knowledge and practical experience through her 18 years in the real estate industry. She spent over 10 years as an estate valuation surveyor at Allison, Peter and Company, and 2 years as property manager at Wicon Properties Limited, and is currently the facilities manager at the PIOJ, Planning Institute of Jamaica. During this time, she has successfully participated in valuation and management of all categories of real estate. Kadian is currently pursuing her Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, RICS, and International Facilities Management Association, IFMA certifications. At this time, Mr. Andrew Miller and Ms. Kadian Pinnock will take the floor and introduce our presenters, Dr. Spencer Robinson and Mr. Ben Elder. Welcome, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. McEnough. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to ALEV's first CPD for the year 2023. Special welcome to our panelists this afternoon, as well as special welcome to my co-moderator this afternoon, Mrs. Kadian Arthur-Spino.
Thank you.
How are you doing, ma'am?
I'm good, and you?
I'm doing well. So we have an interesting topic lined up this afternoon: development versus the environment. And today also we have 2 well-accomplished speakers to address this topic. And I'm excited to see the information that will be shared. As it relates to ESG, many persons may be new to many persons, but I think we are in the right place this evening with the right set of persons to garner information, and that can benefit us both as an association, as well as to our members of this CPD who are not ALEV's members. I think this will be beneficial to the entire built environment profession. So at this time, I have been tasked to introduce to us our first presenter for this afternoon, Dr. Spencer Robinson. Dr. Spencer Robinson is a professor and director of real estate at Central Michigan University. He's the associate editor of the Journal of Sustainable Real Estate and NAIOP Distinguished Fellow, and is the president-elect of the American Real Estate Society, ARES. Dr. Robinson is an internationally recognized scholar in real estate, sustainability, and climate research. In physical risk, Dr. Robinson just led an Urban Land Institute report on how institutional firms are using physical risk analytics and serves on the ASTM International Committee creating a property resilience assessment in transitional risk. His paper on scope 2 and renewable energy credits in the Electricity Journal currently serves as a guidance for numerous policymakers in greenhouse gas measurements. Dr. Robinson regularly speaks to practitioners and academic audience on climate and ESG risk. And today we have the pleasure of sitting in this virtual space and listening to Dr. Robinson speak to us on this topic. So at this time, please make welcome Dr. Spencer Robinson to us.
Andrew, thank you very much for the gracious welcome, and thank you to Katie and Elise and everyone here. I'm just flattered to have the opportunity and share the stage with Ben. I'm very much looking forward to his presentation as well. So let me see if I can share my screen. Technology is always fun when it works. All right, so are we good? We see the presentation?
Yes.
Yes, Dr. Robinson.
All right. We are going to talk about global frameworks for ESG, environmental social governance, and GHG greenhouse gases. Before we start, just a couple caveats. I am a US-based professor. I have expertise in sustainable real estate, and I study quite a bit and follow the global trends and tend to emphasize that research on the US and the EU. The local knowledge that this audience and the panelists that I'm sharing with have of the Caribbean, the challenges and the obstacles, right, that far is going to exceed my own. So I encourage questions, I encourage comments. If there's anything I get wrong, please let me know. I don't claim to be an expert in, specific challenges you face. I did spend a lot of time these past couple of weeks reading articles and getting at least some foundation of knowledge, but kind of like saying I play a doctor on television, right? I have a little bit of surface knowledge. So that said, let's dive in. I think the first question to answer is, what is ESG? I'm sure many in our audience are very familiar with it, but some may not be. So ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. For those who may be familiar with an older term called CSR, corporate social responsibility, this is kind of the newer term. It's been popularized in Europe for quite a while, at least a decade maybe, and has now moved over to the US and has sort of become the global standard. And it allows firms to demonstrate their level of commitment to being a positive force for all of the stakeholders, right? Not just necessarily shareholders or profit, but the stakeholders would be their employees, their customers, their community, their client, right? Really this sense that maybe companies should be more than just profit seeking. They should add to our world. So the environmental, we're going to spend most of our time on the environmental today and talking about greenhouse gases. That is the most defined in terms of how we can measure it, what we can do, and arguably right now, in some contexts, the most important as we're reaching some tipping points on climate change, which I think this audience is well aware of. Social, health and safety, working conditions, the benefits, diversity and inclusion, making sure that we are representative of different cultures and genders and everything else that goes with DEI. If we look at the UN SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, I don't have a picture of them up, but ESG ties very closely to the UN SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. And then governance. How well is the company actually executing these plans? What is the stakeholder engagement? Is pay in the boardroom aligned to what these standards are? One important question we want to understand is, how does climate and ESG, how do climate and ESG rules impact buildings? We're going to talk a lot about climate. Let's bring this into the real estate industry. Again, this is a stat many of you may know, that depending on where we get data, this is from the IEA, International Energy Association, anywhere between 36% of energy, sometimes you'll hear around 40 is a ballpark number, and carbon emissions at about 40% stem from the built environment. So physical buildings contribute roughly 40% of the total greenhouse gases that we emit in the entire world. Let's define a couple more terms and then we can dive into some of the regulations that are emerging across the globe. When we talk about greenhouse gases, we look at that in scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. Scope 1 is essentially greenhouse gases that we emit. So that would be if you had any kind of electric generation on site. So if you had a combined heating and power facility, if you had solar or others, which actually do have a carbon footprint, it's small, but they do have one. Anything that you create on site, that is scope 1. Scope 2 is effectively electricity that you purchase from the grid. So any energy you are using, each individual grid is going to have a carbon footprint. The energy that your building uses, that is your scope 2. Scope 3, which is increasingly important, is all of the greenhouse gas from the entire value chain. So if you are producing a good, and that good includes, if we were to look at, say, soda, right? Soda has corn syrup in it, there's bottling, there's transport. All of those different items are going to contribute to the scope 3. When we talk about buildings, we're not going to talk a lot about embodied carbon, but concrete has a carbon footprint, steel has a carbon footprint, wood does. All of that is going to contribute, depending on how we measure it, to scope 1 or scope 3 of that firm or building. And I guess I'll back up one more slide. Again, the reason this is important is as we start talking about these emerging regulations, and particularly the US and the EU, if companies are going to be required to disclose these, which they are, then the entire value chain of where these goods come from and how they get to their end destination is going to have to be accounted for in the greenhouse gas disclosures. So any industrial building that stores goods, that's part of the carbon footprint of that product. If there's anything that needs to be refrigerated, we have cold storage, right? That's part of that product. So as we move into increased disclosure requirements, the built environment is a really important part of this. And I'm not sure that, particularly at least in the US and lots of other parts of the world, real estate has really caught on to how critical these disclosures are going to be and what the measurements have to be. So briefly, the US Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, has a proposed rule. This was proposed last March, and many people had expected it to be finalized some time ago, but there's been lots of background discussions between the various parts of the US government. There's been a lot of discussions about alignment with the EU in terms of how we measure and what we measure. But the key elements of the rule that are likely to become finalized are that every publicly traded firm must disclose their climate risk, so that's transition risk or their greenhouse gases, and any physical risk. Physical risk means the likelihood that a building has a flood, wildfire, storm surge, any physical risk that could impair that building. For transition risks, all firms will be required to report their scope 1 and scope 2, so the footprint they create and then the electricity that they use. And scope 3 will be required to be reported for all firms except small recording companies. There's a lot of insider talk that the scope 3 requirements will be backed down, in part because we don't really understand scope 3 very well yet. And in order to have this scope 3, we'll have to have disclosures from everyone along our value chain. And we're just not quite at a point where that data is easily accessible or available yet. Importantly, every GHG report will have to have an external attestation. That means similar to if you are a public firm and you have to have your accounting statements reviewed, and then those accounting statements have to be attested by a CPA, a certified public accountant. GHG is going to have an attestation by someone who understands GHG measurements. So you have to have a third-party review of what that is. Physical risk we can break into two components. We have acute and chronic. So acute, that is a hurricane, that is a flash flood from rain, that is a wildfire, that is an acute risk that happens at once. A chronic risk would be as the environment of the globe is heating, will there be heat stress that would impair the use of the building? So this could range from if you are in an area that has been historically warm, well, is it getting hot to the point where you need to have more air conditioning? And will this impact water, which is a separate slide a little bit? In the north, like in Canada, I know I've talked to firms who are struggling with buildings that were built 70 years ago and never envisioned having to have any kind of air conditioning because it never got particularly warm enough. But now, and this is Ben's nodding his head, it's an issue in London as well, we're having buildings that have safety issues because the chronic heat is causing, in some cases, deaths because it's too warm for particularly elderly. So how do we retrofit these buildings in the face of climate change to be able to handle and provide a safe environment? We'll skip this slide. It's kind of more detailed on when the US is expecting things. This is likely to change as the final rule comes out. But in the very near term, every US public firm will be required to report. And the reason this is important is because of that value chain. So if we look at, say, a Walmart or a Target, the really big retailers, if there is any Caribbean firm that has a product that sells to Walmart or to Target or to any other major retailer, those are going to start having to come with disclosures. Those are environmental product declarations, EPDs. That's going to impact your businesses. And part of that is very specifically the built environment. The office building that you work in, the manufacturing facility, the industrial storage, the boat or plane on which they're distributed, all of that's going to have to start being accounted. The EU actually just passed their rule. This became final about a month ago. The CSRD, and I'm blanking out on the acronym, I'll have to look it up again. So the CSRD is, again, big picture. We're not going to go into all of the details of it, but bridging environmental, social, and governance. This is by far the most comprehensive legislation in the world in the requirements for what firms will have to be reporting across each of these three areas. Narrowing it down to some of our conversation, climate is a big piece of it. How are we measuring GHG? What systems are we doing? What are your plans to reduce it? And really importantly, there was a time like a year ago, right? Not long ago, where a lot of firms would say, yeah, we're going to be carbon neutral by 2025 or 2030. And it's really easy to say that, right? I'm going to be carbon neutral by 2030 because I won't be at this job anymore anyway, and I don't care. Right? Those are going away. Now, if you make that pledge, you will have to demonstrate progress towards that pledge every year. Talk about the different steps that you are taking. The time of empty pledges is now past. The regulatory environment is going to be driving down on, hey, if you are making these pledges, you have to start demonstrating that you are realizing them. And the EU and US are different. In the EU, there's a lot more requirements on what firms have to do. In the US, the requirement is on disclosure. So it's not necessarily mandating that a firm make an environmental pledge, but if they do, ensuring that they're disclosing progress towards it. We'll come back to some of these concepts, but just aligning, and we talked a little about alignment, the GHG emissions, a lot of the background talk has been aligning the SFDR, which is the last set of European regulation, the ISSB, which we'll talk about a little bit more. The ISSB is an arm of the IFRS, the International Financial Reporting Standards, that prescribes how to measure ESG and GHG. And then the US SEC, and what I'm envisioning, we'll skip to this one for a second, then come back. One of the questions that we're asked a lot is, all right, what is going to be acceptable to measure? There's a bunch of systems that are not on this slide. So corporate GHG is not on this slide. SBTI, the Science-Based Target Initiative, is not on this slide. I can't forecast exactly what all of these different systems will be. LEAD, the Leadership in Environmental Energy Design, is not on this slide. My personal prediction is that measurement standards are going to coalesce around ones that are aligned to ISO, or the International Organization for Standards. The difference between the International Organization for Standards and some of these others are that, A, they're actually a standards organization, right? ISO is, ASTM is, ANSI is. There's very few others in the world that are actually standards creating organizations. At USGBC, which makes LEAD, has done a lot of wonderful things. They're not a standard organization. They're a private organization that certifies buildings. So the ISSB and the IFRS have indicated they're aligning behind ISO standards. BSI, PAS 2060, is essentially the British version of ISO, and so that will be fine. In terms of ESG specifically, UNPRI and the Equator Principles were called out in an SEC risk statement a little over a year and a half ago, in terms of being globally accepted standards that people could model after. UNPRI has also been in significant discussions with the EU on aligning those standards as well. So if you're looking for places to start, okay, where do I look to measure? What systems, what standards? ISSB is coming out with a bunch of fantastic stuff. And I understand from my conversations that much of the Caribbean is already aligned to IFRS. And so there should be a natural evolution of following ISSB. For broader ESG, UNPRI, the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment, is also a great system. And then the Equator Principles is a little more geared towards financial institutions than it is the built environment. So we'll skip that for the moment. Just back to this, in the EU, these are the dates when people have to align and report. And again, the exact same analogy I made earlier to the US, if you are selling goods or services into Europe, you're going to have to start reporting this, because European firms will need to understand what their value chain is, what the ESG of their suppliers are. This is coming and coming quickly to every part of the globe. Again, why do I think ISO is sort of likely the standard people align around? It's really the only standard that's globally approved. It's in Europe, Japan, Australia, Singapore, Canada, Mexico, Caribbean. It's approved by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Climate Neutral Now Initiative, which is where you report into the UN on your carbon footprint. In the S&P 500 and the US Stock Exchange, about 2/3 of the firms that do report use this. And why ISSB is likely the global standard. IFRS acquired SASB, and sorry for all the acronyms. I'm going to blank out on what SASB acronym stands for, but it was a sustainability standard. The account was the accounting sustainability standard. IFRS brought them and then essentially is merging them into ISSB. For the SEC and the EU, the governing bodies that regulate, they want to ensure that people are meeting a standard. It's not really their job to actually create the standard, because standards change and they evolve. And as our understanding and as economies and our technologies change, then it's the job of someone else to make sure that we're current. IFRS is really an easy place to outsource this for both the SEC and the EU, because they are an international standards organization. They are the international accounting. There's no one in either of those two entities that's going to really say, hey, why are you going to them? That's not appropriate. But they're appropriate, and they're aligning to ISO. So when we get into the climate and GHG portion, it's very science-based and are standards that were made by engineers who understand GHG at a level that maybe some in the real estate community don't have the same level of scientific depth. Okay, so we talked a little about acute and chronic risk. We'll just define them a little more closely again. Acute risk is the event-driven weather, hurricane, tornado, wildfire. Chronic is that long. We talked about it. Another topic, I know we're going quick on a lot of stuff, but these slides will, I think, be made available, is renewable energy credits and carbon offsets. One issue of concern that we see in a lot of markets is we talk about this scope 2. So if you recall, the scope 2 is the GHG footprint that our building uses because of the electricity we pull from the grid. In most parts of the world, there is some level of renewable electricity available. That renewable electricity could be wind or solar or hydroelectric or any number of potential non-fossil fuel sources. What a lot of firms would do is say, okay, we're using renewable energy, and so we've created a carbon offset. So we can use this to offset some of our other carbon creation. That is not how it works. So if you want to create a carbon offset, those must actually be created through a United Nations Clean Development Mechanism, a UNCDM. They're actually securities. They should be traded through a licensed broker. They need to be registered. They have to be tracked. They have to be linked to a specific asset. There's a host of regulatory issues that make these legal. So this industry is one that I think is in the process of changing quite a bit. So if you are a renewable electricity user, that is great, right? It's a good thing to be doing. And you can reduce your own scope 2. But again, there are some rules. That article that Andrew mentioned talks about some specific US rules that I think were unclear. Take caution when you as a firm or as an asset owner are looking to make claims with renewable electricity, renewable energy credits. Make sure that they're properly tracked, they're defined in an asset, and that they qualify for the types of reductions you want to. Acute risk, we'll go back to, I guess these slides got transposed. Sorry about that. This is a graph. I was looking for one specific to the Caribbean region. I couldn't find one, although I do have some data slides we can talk about. But just to demonstrate what the acute risk changes have been, this is a graph of the United States billion-dollar disaster events from 1980 to 2022. And you can clearly see that the number of inflation-adjusted billion-dollar disaster events is increasing at an increasing rate. Right? We're seeing a huge number of events that are causing problems, and that those continue to be more and more significant. On this, I know Andrew mentioned ASTM, which is one of the international standards organizations, is currently developing. It's almost finalized. Hooray, it's been a long road. A property resilience assessment to be able to standardize how do we assess this physical risk on the built environment? How do we communicate it? What are the standards we should be applying? You may be familiar with the ASTM environmental. There's a lot of, in some parts of the world, there's a lot of legal benefits by having an environmental phase 1. I know there are some data challenges in the Caribbean. You may be familiar with the ASTM environmental and property condition report. They have a lot of standards that are focused on the built environment. So climate change in Jamaica, again, I think many of you are seeing this and have more detailed information than I do, but here's an image of erosion at Hellshire Beach. I read a lot about issues on sargassum on various coastlines and how this is impacting the environment. This is very much real. It's very much impacting the local communities in which you live. And so impacting climate change in a positive way, it is really everyone's responsibility across the globe. And it's not an individual regions because it's impacting everywhere across the world. Again, I can't claim to have a deep understanding of what the challenges in the Caribbean are. This is from an academic article just published by Theo Fritoff, Thomas Lisner, and Schlossner. And the biggest issue that their survey raised was financial resources. And so we want to do the right thing. We want to be able to make changes, but we're capped by the financial resources we have. And the second, and I think Aleaves is doing a great job with this and their other education to help create some awareness, is information awareness, right? The first step is understanding what should we do, what do we need to do, and then, hey, once we're starting to understand how, financial resources are a challenge, but until we understand what we need, you can't go get resources for that. This is a map from Mona Jesus. I'm blanking out on the name. Totally the absent-minded professor type. So big picture things. Easy to remember, the Mona Geoinformatics Institute, which was publicly available. So I thank them for this really great visualization. This is 45 unique flooding events and 12 major landslides in Jamaica from the past year preceding 2022. Again, just visualizing that climate change is impacting your local community in quite a number of ways. This is repeated because it's important. If you want to start measuring, these are the systems that I recommend. There may be other ones that make sense, but at least from my perspective, looking at sort of the global trends, if you're using any of these, it's going to be applicable anywhere in the world. You're going to be fine in terms of having these measurements. No one's going to question where they came from or how you did them. These are standards that are global and well designed. I appreciate your time. I'm not sure the best next format if we do questions or have our next speaker, but thank you very much for listening. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Robinson. Great presentation. I know many persons would have been very interested to hear what was presented to us, because just off the bat, the whole aspect of climate change has become a major talking point for not only persons in Jamaica and the built environment, but due to some stirring speeches delivered primarily by Barbadian Prime Minister Mayor Mottley at COP26 and 27, the climate change aspect has been put to the forefront. And ESG now being presented to us in this format, seeing what will be necessary to be done in order for us to exist in this global marketplace. You have really brought it home for us. And if you could just refresh us on the scope. I think it was scope 3 where it says that all firms will need to report, except for small reporting companies. What would those entail?
So let me make sure I'm understanding your question before I do. Thank you to, I don't know whether it was Rochelle or Amanda or whoever was writing the acronyms that I completely forgot up in the chat. Thank you for doing that. That was helpful. So are you asking who will be required to report scope 3 or to define scope 3 more clearly?
All right, both, because I think if you can go back to the slide, it says that except for small reporting companies, what constitutes a small reporting company?
That is an excellent question, and it is quite honestly vague. And this is, let me bring this slide back up. This is the part that I think is most contentious in the US and is most likely to be backed down. You know, the US is different than other parts of the world, and for the SEC to require firms to report things that are in their control, the scope 1 and the scope 2, I think we'll get through the system. To require them to report scope 3, which is their value chain, which is not so much in their control, I have a hunch that's going to be pushed down the road a while, because the uncertainty and the reliance on third parties, I think, is going to be a lot of pushback. What scope 3 is it is that whole value chain. So if we were to think of a computer, we're thinking of a computer, right? A computer has a chip, it has a motherboard, it has a plastic case, it has a monitor. Most all of those different components came from different parts of the world. Each of those is going to have a carbon footprint. So once we bring all this together, in order to understand the carbon footprint of this computer, we need that entire value chain. So that is the, not the entirety of the scope 3, but that is the scope 3. And then when we're transporting a good, are we transporting that? Someone has to own the carbon footprint of that transportation, whether it went on a boat or a plane or a train or a truck. That greenhouse gas footprint has to be accounted for. And what often will happen now is this, right? Is everyone, sorry, my hand's higher. There we go, this. Is everyone saying, well, you know, it's really theirs. No, it was theirs. And so it's easy to say, well, it's no one's, we'll just ignore it. Part of what this is trying to do is put numbers for transparency purposes. And Ben, you are more than welcome to jump in and answer these as well. You obviously have some expertise here. So please, if you have better descriptions or different, I welcome your insight.
Oh, thanks, Spencer, and a great presentation, and some really thought-provoking issues that are going to challenge the whole decision-making realm that we operate in, and the sort of the measurement issues, which we'll come on back to in a few moments. But this value chain processes. If I can use the example of the UK, I was in a meeting yesterday, and the Bank of England, about 9 months ago, required all the banks in the UK to do an environmental audit against their loan books. So and it wasn't about about environmental issues. It was actually about the financial stability of the banks. In other words, if climate changed by X, then how many of the properties that they use as security would be still have the same value as they do that are logged in the loan books. And the problem was, I mean, there was a report made, but actually the banks didn't hold the information, because many of those loans were made 10, 15, 20 years ago, and those questions weren't asked. So yesterday, we actually in London, we spent a whole day talking to the financial institutions and the valuers to decide who was going to ask what questions and who was responsible for gathering that data, which could then answer the Bank of England's questions in a meaningful way. So I think this whole process is about trying to identify what questions need to be answered and creating a framework so that there's some consistency in that. And going back to this scope 3 process, that's one of the big challenges, particularly if some of the goods are coming from less developed nations, which might not have those data points available. But I think that the whole risk management process, that this is driving enormous change, and nobody likes change, but it's driving that decision-making process of getting the data and making businesses, individuals responsible for declaring where they are. Previously, we had the social declaration, but it didn't really mean very much. And people said they were socially responsible, but it was only in a strap line, and it was put on all the company headings. But actually, as soon as you turn the page, everybody had forgotten about it. But it's too important now. So yeah, some really great challenges in front of us, and an area which, and this might sound very trite, very glib, but somewhere where we can really make a big difference and help the future. So I see it as long overdue, but very exciting. Sorry, Spencer, that's probably a long answer to the pass of the ball.
No, not at all. I think one takeaway, and then Andrew, please more questions. One takeaway is, the US and the EU, the probably arguably most advanced economies in the world, are still figuring this out. So one of the questions I get from people in both those economies and across the globe is, well, what do we do? The answer is just get started, right? You don't have to have the full solution today, but it's a process, and it's a process that we're all sharing. So the quicker you get started and begin to understand the terms and the tools, the more easily you'll be able to deliver on solutions when we hopefully converge at some point on what they are.
All right. Thank you very much, Ben. Thank you very much, Spencer. All right. Well, Ben preempted me in moving into the other aspect of where we were thinking of going, because majority of the persons online here are linked to real estate or appraisal. So now, with this move where ESG is concerned, I think it's twofold in that we have to consider both the intangibles and the tangible when we're looking at real estate. And as you mentioned, the IFRS standards that we are governed by. But in terms of where the value comes in, as Ben mentioned, how does this change the approach, say, for valuers in a developing nation as Jamaica, in how we conduct appraisals, especially when we're looking at commercial properties as well as industrial, where we now considering their carbon footprint.
Scope 1 and 2.
Scope 1 and 2. How do we meet that challenge?
So I think there's a couple questions there, Andrew. One is, how does it impact value? And the short answer to that is we have no idea. I would welcome what Rick's view is on this. I know I'm talking to some people in the Appraisal Foundation in the US. At this point, people aren't really considering it, and it's actually a kind of an academic question I've been struggling with. Is how do we put a value on this? Again, I think at this point, the advice is start thinking about it. If your building has a large carbon footprint that is going to be impacting its value, there are municipalities, both city or state level in the US and then country level in the EU and some others, where the concept of a economic obsolescence of an asset is becoming increasingly clear, that at some point, if a building emits a level of carbon that is above the requirements of that state, and those requirements are gradually being brought down, then it becomes obsolescent. Either needs to be renovated to a point where it can meet those standards, or torn down, which most of these models don't consider. There's a lot of embodied carbon in actually tearing something down, and then the whole process of cleaning it and the land transition is not being factored in very well yet. So there's not an exact answer, unfortunately. I wish I had one. But the answer is just start thinking about it. What can we do to begin to reduce these? And if I'm looking at a building, its infrastructure becomes an increasingly important question.
All right, thank you very much. And I think this is where I'll now hand over to Mrs. Kadian Arthurs, to move into the second segment of our CPD for this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Miller. And thank you to Dr. Spencer Robinson. Appreciate the information that has been brought to us. Now, we have heard Ben's voice, but let me officially introduce him and welcome to Alev's and our team here. Mr. Ben Elder. Ben is responsible for delivery of the RICS Global Valuation Strategy, which has a key role in securing global financial stability through participation by the RICS in the development and application of international valuation standards. He is well qualified for this role as an economist and chartered surveyor with an interest in the interface of the economy and property markets, and is the author of a chapter in the Roulage Handbook on Sustainable Real Estate. Ben has been a practicing valuer and respected academic, holding senior positions at Nottingham Trent University and the College of Estate Management, and chairs the IVSC Tangible Assets Board and is a member of the Standards Board. Ben is also an immediate past chair of Commission 9, that is valuation, for the International Federation of Surveyors, FIG. Ben has recently been working with a team on developing guidance and evaluation of unregistered land for UN Habitat and FIG. Welcome to Ben to the floor, and he'll be talking to us today on topic 2, incorporating the ESG framework practically in the Caribbean. Let's listen to Ben. Thank you and welcome.
Thanks, Katie, and again, thanks for Spencer for a great introduction to some of the challenges which are out there and that we're all having to deal with on a daily basis. I've opted for not having any slides, and I just welcome the opportunity to talk to you about the challenges that you face. My international role has taught me an enormous amount over a long period of time, as you can see by the grey hair. But the thing that I've learnt is that many problems appear to be in local markets, but when you actually take that away and try and look at the real underlying principles and the problems, they're actually internationally applicable. And again, Spencer talked about measurement at a particular points in time. And Katie, and it's great to have you on the panel here as a facilities manager, because again, I think that we need to identify who are the best parties to start to deliver this change, and facilities managers have got an enormous role to play in that transition and that process of capturing the data, which then informs the market, which then drives the values, and that whole chain of delivery is so very important. Spencer again talked about measurement, and the RICS were involved in a project about 5-6 years ago around the measurement of property, and we basically discovered that there were various methods of measuring a piece of real estate. The RICS had their code of measuring practice. BOMA in the US had their standards. The API in Australia had their standards. The HKIS in Hong Kong had their standards. And they're all perfectly good standards, but they were just different. And depending on which measurement system you adopted, you could get up to a 24% difference in the reported area of a building. So this is not even looking at its performance. This is just looking at how the reporting of the size of the building was recorded and reported. And if you then take that forward to saying, well, how the heck then can we measure the carbon output when we don't even have a consistent measurement to the building in the first place? The challenges become multiplied, and so there is now an international property measurement standard, which helps to at least provide a consistent basis for measuring, and then you can start to put the carbon output or whatever you're trying to measure alongside those measurement standards, which then creates this consistency in data. And I think that those sort of standardization, along with for example, the international valuation standards, which feed directly into the IFRSs, the valuation element of financial reporting is really, really important. Without it being consistent, then actually the output of the IFRSs is meaningless. So again, we need to make sure that we are providing this consistency in approach and clarity of information and transparency about what we've done and what we haven't done in the process that we're providing. Again, I think it's if I got a really key driver that I would like to see, and this probably sounds very simple, but I would love to see a full stop after the E, a full stop after the S, and a full stop after the G, because they're completely different measurements. The environmental, the social, which I actually think is probably the most difficult element to measure, is really challenging, and the governance part is probably easier to identify because it's probably captured in documentation. So that process, but the impact on a social process really needs everyone to come together to recognize how we achieve that social process. And the examples I've used in the past are, for example, if you've got an urban area and you create a beautiful park, a green park in that urban area. The social benefits are enormous, but how do you measure them? How do you just measure the change in value of the surrounding real estate? That's one measure. Do you measure the change in air quality, which then drives better productivity in the factories? Those are the type of challenges that we need to start to think about and try to bring to the table with some solutions. Because again, I think one of the historic faults in the real estate industry is that we tend to look at buildings statically. There's usually, particularly for valuers, it's a point of time involvement with that building. It's a valuation on a date. And probably perhaps looking forward to how well that might perform as a security for a loan or whatever the purpose of the valuation might be. But these changes in the reporting structure are really forcing the valuer to start to take a forward look in the valuation process. And I could probably hear all the valuers on the call going, oh, we can't predict values. No, I'm not saying that we predict values, but we've got to get better at assessing what the future is going to hold. People only buy real estate for the future income or pleasure of using that building. They don't buy it for the past. And what the role of the valuer is to assess how the market is interpreting those potential future values. And then we have to put the risk against it to work out how likely those benefits are going to continue into the future. And as Spencer talked about a few moments ago, if the regulations are going to change, and therefore I will not be able to let my building in 5 years' time because the regulations have changed, because they're going to put a minimum energy efficiency rating on a building, and unless your building meets that criteria, you cannot let it, and that already exists in the UK and in parts of Europe. Then as part of my valuation, I need to be saying, well, that regulation is going to come in 2025, 26, whenever it might be. That means that the person who owns this building, if they want to maintain the income, are going to have a capital expenditure of X between now and that date. And I can probably discount it back and spread it over a period of time. But that starts to drive that impact on value, because again, valuers are there to interpret the market. We're not there to make the market. And sometimes valuers don't like what the market is actually doing. But our job is to report what the market is doing. And one of the projects I've been working on at the RICS recently is to really make it clear when the valuer is carrying out their regulatory function. In other words, what is the market doing and what is the market value of this piece of real estate, against what the advice bit might be, which many clients are looking for, and making sure that the advice piece is separate from the regulatory function, because again, I guess there are one or two people sitting on this this call, sort of looking at their professional indemnity, their responsibility, and how they might be sued for advice which they give. So it needs to be really clear about which bit is the regulatory function, the valuation, and then which bit is advice which you might want to give to your client to help them meet these regulatory changes. Because until the market actually starts to react, then the valuer is going to keep reporting these careful what I say now, but these old numbers, these unadopted numbers. I also think that the valuation profession needs to upskill. We need to understand these issues much better than we do, and I would hold my hand up alongside that. Again, for example, I've been doing some work in what's called the circular economy. And this is about branding and benchmarking and putting barcodes on elements within buildings and then giving it a guarantee. So just like your car, we've got a car at home, and when we purchased it, or took it on an agreement about 3 years ago, the salesman said to me, when it gets ready for a service, this red light will come on and you must get it serviced within 30 days. I can't remember the actual number. He said, otherwise it will stop working. The car will not run. And I sort of said, oh, come on, that's just a ruse to make me come in and use your service agreements. And he turned around to me and he said, okay, we can arrange to switch it off if you want to, but then I will not be able to give you the balloon payment at the end of the deal, which I can offer you now. So the value of that car was enhanced because it had been serviced in accordance with the manufacturer's requirements, and therefore at the end of the deal they were able to guarantee me a bigger payment. And that sort of finance is going to come into real estate. We're going to get to the point where the steel beam, which has a 50-year lifespan, will have a barcode on it, and if the building becomes uneconomic, say after 20 years, then that steel beam will be reintroduced into the marketplace and be sold at a at a price which would recognize its 30-year unused life. Whereas at the moment, it just goes into a demolition process and then gets recycled, but there's no real guarantee process around it. And that guarantee process, I think, is going to change the environmental issues just as much as the financial reporting side, because that becomes really tangible. Again, I remember going to the Middle East a number of years ago, and I was talking to one of the FM people out there, and they said that all the lifts that they use in the tall buildings in Dubai, etc., they're given a guarantee by the manufacturers. But actually, when they're doing the valuations out there at that time, they were marking them down by 50%. So they were sort of saying if there was a 20-year guarantee with a lift, they were actually assuming it would be need replacing after 10 because of, one, the harsh environment, the heat, the extreme temperature changes that would cause damage to them, and secondly, because the skilled labour wasn't there to service those lifts appropriately to manufacturers' requirements, and so they were writing those elements down in that process, and that's a risk management process. And I think that those changes in environmental circumstances that we all know are happening, unfortunately, will start to drive those changes in risk management. And again, sort of turning back to Jamaica. If some of the hotel developments are in floodplains, then that's going to have an impact on the value of those buildings. If it's in the hurricane path, then certain constructions need to be in place, and the certification there to be able to lay off some of that risk to other parties. And we've seen the terrible consequences of earthquakes in Turkey over the last few days. But the tsunami effect issues in and around the Caribbean are a real critical element, as Spencer's already identified. So I see the valuation process as reflecting the market, but we've got to make sure that we are collecting the data that needs to be in place to make informed decisions. And again, it's probably quite easy to say, well, the data doesn't exist, therefore I can't do that. I don't hold with that. I think that we need to start to put systems in place to collect the data. We're good at this. This is our expertise. If we relinquish this responsibility, then somebody else will come and take this business away from us. We need to make sure that we are capturing the data that is needed. And again, looking at technology, in many of the mature nations, the buildings are already starting to talk to each other rather than talk to individual owners and individual management. Just like, again, the car sat-nav systems, when they were introduced, the Internet of Things, when the cars were just reporting back to one server, actually they didn't tell us very much about traffic congestion. But as soon as they were interlinked and the cars actually talked to each other, suddenly we've got a meaningful set of data which starts to flow through, and we then make decisions whether we go down this road or that road. That's going to happen in real estate, and we're going to be able to have a dashboard of information which says, yeah, this building is using 10% above the average of electricity or energy or whatever it might be, and therefore is emitting X number of carbon units above average. And that's going to drive the decision making for investors and the banks. And there already is evidence that differential interest rates have been charged on different types of loans and their environmental performance. Because remember, the banks, the financial institutions, will also be making these returns that Spencer talked about. So they need good environmentally performing bits of real estate in their portfolio to then retain their image and their processes within the financial reporting. So I think that one of the biggest challenges we've got is moving, or much of the regulation is targeted at the entity level, so the firm level, whereas much of the work we do as valuers and professionals in the real estate industry are targeted at the particular building. And we need to do a lot of work to work out how those cumulative effects will be reported back in at the entity level. And I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges that we that we have. But but I think that the change which is underway and has been started is really it's really important. It probably goes without saying. The challenge is, how do you grasp that opportunity? And I'm probably going to say something now which will reflect nicely with some of the people on the audience, but probably not so nicely with some of the others, is who's going to pay for this all this information? I can see the valuers sort of folding their arms and say, I don't get paid enough for doing the work I do at the moment. How the heck am I going to go out and get all this other information that we need? The people who are the architects and the developers are probably going, God, those valuers charge a lot of money before, and they don't really provide me with the information that I need to deliver. There's got to be a coming together of that space. And the valuers need to be able to demonstrate to their clients the added value that they provide to the process. And traditionally, it's probably been about providing a valuation just to go out and get a loan. Now it's going to be providing a valuation which provides the environmental information which allows them to get a loan at an appropriate level, and maybe only getting a loan if that environmental information is appropriately incorporated. And I'll probably slow down there because I'm just looking at the time, and I'd love some questions to come back in, and so we can pick up some of the local challenges that you experience in Jamaica. So I'll draw breath there and pass back to you, Kadian.
Okay, thank you so much, Ben. It's really a very interesting conversation, and it will continue because I understand that quite a bit of questions have been coming in so far. But to tie both yourself and Spencer's conversation together, my thing is, what I'm picking up is that quite a bit of reporting is going to become required, especially from the international market, and that may impact our local real estate market in terms of what we produce. So as valuers, what are we to look for? What kind of information are we to capture if we're going to put this information into our valuation report so that investors can have it on their books to say, hey, these properties may have this feature, and how does it lend to the sustainability practices that we're looking for?
I'll jump in, and Spencer, you can tell me I'm wrong. But I think that there needs to be that conversation. I think that valuers really need to understand the issues that Spencer was talking about and how they are going to be interpreted by businesses and what they need to do. I mean, there is one model which says, yeah, don't bother, just continue with a local market, and you will. It will be a local market. But if you want to invest, if you want international investors to come in, if you want foreign direct investment to come in, then they will be looking for these requirements. And it won't stop at the financial institutions. It will be the International Monetary Fund. It will be the World Bank. It will be those global financial regulators. We're just moving into a Basel III/4 process where the financial regulations are going to change again, where there's a possibility of a prudent value being imposed on all markets. So it's slightly different from market value. There's no real clarity about where it's going to go yet. But I'm pretty sure that all those global regulators will be looking and saying these are the steps which we need to make to ensure not just that we're being good and we're looking after the planet, but to make sure that the next global financial crisis isn't imposed by a climate change, because a global financial crisis on top of global warming would be a double whammy.
Kenny, I'll just add, and I think Ben, your answer is great. Start small. And so the most measurable component is the carbon footprint.
Mhm.
And if it becomes standardized to start adding a carbon footprint where you can, I think that is the next step. And then I'll throw in my professor role. For those who don't know, Basel, it's actually a city in Switzerland, but it is also the international banking standards. So all of the large international banks follow Basel guidelines. So them changing influences all the large national banks.
Okay, great. Now, this requires valuers and real estate professionals to be informed. What are the trends do you think that we need to look for, or are there informations or places we can go to find what is happening in the marketplace that would influence these sustainable practices?
Yeah, again, I will go back to the RICS as I work for them. Within our global red book, our standards, there is a requirement already, and there has been for 2 or 3 years, for all valuers to reference sustainability, ESG issues, not just in their thinking, but actually within their reports. So it starts to build that process that all valuers should be, every time they go out to look at a piece of real estate or do some investigations, sustainability or ESG should be top of their list. And we expect to see within the valuation reference about how they've considered that, and that might be reasonably simple. So again, is it likely to flood? What have you done to make sure it's the property is not liable to normal flooding? Now, if it's on top of the hill, that's probably pretty straightforward to say. But if it's lower down near the coast or on one of those floods, have you checked the maps that Spencer's already put up there? If you've, I always, again, and I appreciate that within the Caribbean and particularly Jamaica, there isn't a culture of being sued for your information as there is in the States and other parts of Europe and the UK. But I always take the view that if I'm going to do, or when I used to do valuations, I used to do a risk assessment immediately. The risk to my client and also the risk to me, so that I could then work out what fee I needed to pay, charge for that. And if I didn't get that fee, I didn't do the job because the risk was too high. So what amount of work do I need to do a professional job to deliver the information which my client needs to fulfill the purpose for which the valuation is being commissioned? And I know, again, I can hear the people shouting at my screen saying, yeah, but somebody down the road will do it cheaper and therefore I won't get the job. Well, do you really want that sort of work, which puts you at risk for not very much fee? And I think that sort of mentality, and I think the whole profession, right from valuers all the way through developers, FM people, need to start to come together to understand those risks. And seminars like this, Katie, and the information Spencer's given to you today is invaluable. That gives you the checklist to start saying, I need to think about this when I go out tomorrow morning. Not next week, not next month, but some of those points are really already there. And if you start to collect that data now, you're going to be ahead of the game in 2-3 years' time, which is going to put you in a really, really strong position to move forward. And the only other point I would add is that, again, I was at a legal seminar 2-3 months ago, and the legal profession are really worried that they used to hide behind the sort of caveat that we haven't looked at this, therefore it doesn't exist. that's not going to hold water for very much longer. Probably a bad acronym with the when we're talking about flooding, but it's going. You're not going to be able to get away by putting into your valuation report. I haven't looked into these issues. It's your problem. Don't worry about it. I'm going to assume everything's okay, because that. Court of laws are going to say, I'm sorry, that is not a professional approach. So sort of looking at those caveats within contracts, I think is another step which is overdue in many places. Spencer, I don't know whether you've got anything that you want to add to that.
You did a great job. I think you brought up the concept of resilience, which we haven't talked about much, where, you know, that human element, if we have these buildings that are likely to flood, there's lots of data to understand that. And then what are we doing to that physical structure to preserve the structure and, even more importantly, ensure the safety of the inhabitants of that structure.
So understanding the area analysis, the dynamics of what's happening in that particular zone is important in terms of our reporting to our clients so that they are able to understand what is required, as well as also the data set that is captured in the valuation report in terms of our assets. Are they old? What's the life cycle of these assets? How sustainable are they? This kind of information is crucial to reporting as valuers that aids our developers or asset owners or investors, so that not only locally but internationally, we're able to ascertain and determine, yes, this building has the features and we're able to invest and willing to partner with this person. So definitely a crucial point for us to take away from this session. Now we'll move forward and open the floor to our guests. I think Rochelle has on hand quite a bit of questions. Rochelle, you want to go ahead with the questions?
Okay, thank you very much, Kadian. I have some questions that came to me directly. The first one is from Dr. Beal, Tina Beal. This question is for Ben. Considering that the valuer at this point in time can't measure how ESG factors or variables affect the market value of properties, what role can automated valuation modeling, broadly defined, play in measuring the impact of ESG variables on value? In addition, are there any plans on enhanced or increased implementation of automated valuation modeling in real estate markets of the global north and developing south?
Nice, easy question. Yeah, I thought you'd start with a nice, easy one. I think there are two things. I think it's really important to recognize that within the international valuation standards, there is a definition of market value. And whether it's created by an individual valuer or an automated valuation model, somebody somewhere has responsibility for ensuring that that number equates to market value. And the automated system is sort of falls into two sections. There's one which is a totally automated system where the machine decides which comparables it's going to pick, and the machine then does the valuation, pumps out the number. Then there's the semi-automated process where a valuer is still responsible for doing the number, but they're using an automated system to assist them. And then the third one is the more traditional valuation, which we're probably all aware of. I think at our peril we ignore technology. That there is a lot of information out there which can be captured very well by machine learning and processes, but it's producing the evidence which is important. When the valuation, I probably should have said this at the beginning, but I believe that, when I used to do valuations, you would you'd go out and do your inspection, capture your data, put it into the model and write your report. But before you sent it off, either somebody else checked it or you took a big deep breath and thought, is that right? Am I prepared to put my signature on the bottom of this report at that number? And the problem with the automated system is that due diligence, which traditionally comes at the end of a valuation, needs to be in place at the very beginning, so that you have confidence in the model and where it's going to get its data from, so that you do all that deep breath and is this right at the very beginning, and it's going to pump out the numbers at the far end. Whether those can actually, I don't think automation should assist in the ESG element. Again, I'm a great believer that ESG elements are baked into the market. I don't think they are separate. They are in there, and even if I do a valuation today and I don't mention ESG, ESG is actually baked into the market because that's what the market is making those decisions on. I think that what's actually happening, and it's being driven by some of the things that Spencer's talked about, is that because of the reporting mechanisms, the clients are now wanting more explicit reference to ESG and sort of saying, out of that $2 million building, how much of that is ESG related? And that becomes really, really difficult. There is some evidence from major cities that green buildings fetch a premium and they let quicker than brown buildings. So therefore, if you're doing a discounted cash flow, that equates to a greater value. I actually prefer to think about it actually as a brown discount, that actually we should be looking at saying, well, look, that's the market level. But if a building needs retrofitting, that's sort of, you need to discount the greenness by that amount to get to what the market should pay for that. So the automation bit, I think, can assist, particularly as buildings will start to talk to each other, as I said earlier on, and they generate data, then that can feed into an automated process. But the valuer still needs to have their finger on the button or the pulse or whatever the right terminology is.
Thank you so much, Ben.
That helps.
Thank you, Ben. Spencer, any comment?
I wasn't going to, but I'll just add one thing. You said at the end about the green building certifications having premiums. That is true. I've written some of that literature myself. However, my personal prediction is that is changing. The green building certifications served as a market signal of environmental awareness and environmental excellence. As we move into a world where the carbon footprint of every building is going to be somewhat accessible and probably publicly accessible, I think the impact of those starts to wane. And while they did a great job during the time they were relevant, my personal expectation is that that relevance is increasingly less and less as we move forward, as more empirical and uniform sets of data become available to be able to measure that environmental and signal it.
Okay, great. Thank you. Rochelle, any other questions for us?
There's another one for Dr. Robinson. Considering that small island developing states like Jamaica aren't the main producers of GHG emissions, some may question, why should local businesses need to adopt ESG standards? Based on your presentation, these changes are coming, and some members of our population lack knowledge on the implications of adopting these standards. Have there been instances where the implementation of these or similar standards have resulted in high implementation and transaction costs for citizens in lower developing countries, LDCs, or least developed countries, rather?
I don't have a great answer for that question. I think the best analog, and I've used this in some of the written work, is in the 90s, the global community started to pay a lot more attention to environmental hazards than we had. Right? It really started in the late 70s, early 80s, and by the 90s, when that ASTM environmental phase 1 standard was there was a lot more focus on that. And it started with government and really high-level financial markets. That's where things tend to start to manifest first, and then into the developed economies, and then trickling down into the less developed and then least developed nations using the UN categories. This is a question about the economic burden of doing this, and it is a great question. I don't have a good answer, but I do expect it to follow a similar trend where the nations that can economically absorb this start the trend, and then it slowly moves down. I don't know the environmental history of the Caribbean, but if I had to venture a guess, I would expect that the environmental standards and the pollution that's put in the water and the groundwater is significantly less than it was 20 or 25 years ago. And so this didn't happen instantaneously or overnight. It was a transition over time. So Katie, to your point earlier, should valuers start including this information? The valuers who start doing that today, in 5 or 10 years, will be the experts that are sought out for when this is important and potentially regulated. So I think that transition is going to happen over time and is a burden, you are right, that the more economically developed nations will start to bear, and then organizations like the IMF and the World Bank will hopefully help fund that financial constraint we showed earlier from the surveys that is an issue.
Thank you, Spencer.
I
Ben?
think if I could just add to that, I absolutely agree completely. I don't think you should lose sight also, though, that many of the developing nations haven't got the shackles of the stock that many of the developed nations have already got. I mean, one of the challenges in the UK is that the new buildings are a fraction of the built environment, probably only 1 or 2%, and we've got this 98% which is already existing and is appalling in its environmental performance, and how you retrofit those appalling buildings is going to be a massive burden for the UK economy to put right, and some of the developing nations haven't got that burden, and so there's an opportunity to jump forward to making sure that the new buildings meet those requirements, and right across Europe it's the same thing, and parts of the States as well, where some of the cities are, and again, as Spencer mentioned, sort of the embodied energy. You can't just knock it down, because actually you're going to use more energy to put back up, and there's a real dilemma in that space of retrofit to put big urban 1920 buildings back into being performing I'll only say reasonably well.
If I can add. Go ahead,
right.
Andrew.
All right.
Go ahead.
Thanks, Andrew. Now, tying in that comment, the fact that Jamaica is a signatory to the UN agreement and also a part of our mandate is the Vision 2030 that speaks to our sustainable management of natural resources and urban and rural development. This too requires that we still have some things to do as it relates to the ESGs. Part of it comes in with our focus now on the net zero. We have our first net zero building by Mono. Elements to that effect are being implemented through different aspects of how people manage and do development. So part of it, even though we are not a major contributor, we still have a responsibility to do our part because we are signatories to the UN agreement. Andrew?
Okay, yeah, you're on the same part that I was on. Because I'm gonna add, considering mostly from the manufacturing perspective, where the greenhouse gas emission is looked at as an externality, most cases a negative externality. And in places like Europe and America, we have mechanisms in place. You may have like marketable pollution permits and so on, where they trade, and you have some level of control that is implemented in what firms can do and what level they can emit at. I think it's fair to say that we in the Caribbean, by extension, Jamaica by extension, the Caribbean, are not at that level as yet. So I think for us, it also includes a governmental perspective in it, in terms of the framework or the policy has to come from the government firstly, and then us as valuers know, because of that framework, we lean on that framework to garner information to help us in what we're doing. So Dr. Robinson, based on your experience, how do you see, what do you see as the best way to go about this? Whether from, I think, from the side of Europe where there is strict governmental rules, or do we put the market to work in terms of GHG and so on?
I am gonna punt that question back to really you and Katie, because there's no perfect roadmap for anywhere. I mean, we have a vision and a goal, but it takes local community, it takes local culture. For you to achieve that goal, I think the best process to do it is driven by the people in Jamaica and in the Caribbean. And I can talk big picture about systems and maybe where that goal should be, but how to get there, you guys have better expertise on that than I do.
As Andrew said, the framework will from the government is what will help dictate. Because while development and that infrastructure redevelopment is being done individually, what really forces a lot of us to comply is the governmental framework. So the reuse of water for secondary uses, that has become part of our culture in some aspects, but not enough. The government now requires the harvesting of rainwater for some aspects of our development. That too is a part of the framework that will encourage. We see even in smaller elements where the government is now dictating that the emissions from vehicles, that too, they're charging persons for vehicles that are smoking, that kind of thing. So the emissions on that element, their government itself is what is creating that framework for how we operate here in Jamaica. And it is also influenced by how our developers and our real estate personnel respond to these international requirements.
I knew Katie would answer that better than me.
Thanks.
I think added to that though, don't abdicate responsibility. Don't wait for governments to come in and do whatever you think is needed. You've got an opportunity as a fantastic association, which has got all sorts of different skill sets in it, from the architects to the developers, to the valuers, to the realtors, a whole range of people. Is getting together and starting to try to agree, first of all, who holds what information. It might sound very simple, but there are lots of people, lots of parties to a development, and they all hold slightly different bits of information, and we're not very good at sharing that information. And it's that's needed to actually sort of and if you could get some sort of agreement within your or best practice, don't be scared and wait for everybody to come and tell you what to do. What Jamaica needs is probably 80% the same as what other places need, but there's going to be a local element which is needed. And I would encourage you as a group to sort of come back together again and sort of start to say, well, yeah, okay, what can we do now to show that we really want to participate in getting Jamaica to where it needs to be with its ESG goals?
Definitely. Thank you so much. Any other questions from our team? Rochelle?
Yes, I have one more from Kevin Johnson. I think we touched it, but let's just ask it directly. Will the challenge for information impact existing or new buildings? Do you envisage regulation will be in place for building materials to reduce carbon impact? I think we touched it, but let's be specific.
I just threw a link into the chat where Kevin asked this question. This is for the Carbon Leadership Forum EC3 tool. So I mentioned the word EPDs, Environmental Product Declarations. It's an acronym that will become increasingly common. An EPD says the carbon footprint of a product. There's a number of building materials that have that, and this regulation is already in place. For example, in the US, the GSA, the Government Services Agency, which is the US government agency that manages all of the owned and leased real estate for the US government. They're the largest landlord in the world, I believe. They mandated last March, April, that all concrete and asphalt manufacturers start reporting EPDs in order to do any government work and ideally be carbon neutral. Yes, I do think this is coming. I think this is going to trickle globally, that the building materials, right now, most of the focus is on this operating carbon. So we look at that scope 1 and scope 2, that's the carbon we're using by operating. The embodied carbon, or the carbon inside a building, there's going to be a larger and larger spotlight on it. So absolutely, yes. Exactly when and exactly how, that is anybody's guess, but it is definitely on its way.
Thank you. Are there any other questions?
Not right now.
If Dr. Robinson, as you mentioned earlier, I know in the United States there is like agencies such as the DEP where you can get contaminated. You can just go onto the DEP website and have contamination information on different sites in different states. In a Jamaican perspective, I don't think we have. I'm using the word "don't think we have" that information that is readily available to us, and especially us in this context as valuers, that you can go to a site and you can know before you reach the site that this was the site of this site had contamination maybe 10 or 15 years ago. But in places such as the US, these are information that is readily available. So that now will impact the quality of the work that a person in that market can do. I would say compared to persons in a developing market such as Jamaica. So even though a profession, a body like Alev's is doing a lot, I think there's still a point that governmental support still has to be there in terms of furnishing with the information such as that.
You make a bunch of great points, Andrew. Do you have a question?
No, I'm saying no. That for us, do we now look at the point at the place where information, maybe should it be a case where we're looking to the government to supply us with more information in terms of that, then we can then act on that information?
So, there's an argument, if you look at the sort of base economic means of production, we have, labor, capital, and property. I really think in the modern world, information is the fourth factor of production. So absolutely, information is critical in terms of the right way to aggregate in that and distribute it. In a lot of places, that is the government's role to be able to do that. In some cases, private sector starts that. So again, the optimal way to do that in the Caribbean and Jamaican context, I don't know the answer to that. but certainly a government role in doing that and providing that information, it's really important to not just values, but to humans. When we look at building in a contaminated environment, these are our children and our grandchildren that get sick from contamination. There is a definite public good of having that information readily accessible by the development community.
All right. Thank you very much.
I'd agree, and I jump back in again, and that you need. I think that you can't just wait for governments to do all this. You need to engage with them about the conversation, about how your organization can help them meet their goals. I think if you just keep asking governments for, we can't do this until you provide us with this, then you're going to be waiting a long time in most governmental organizations, not just in the Caribbean, but globally. But going along with constructive suggestions about the type of information that you would like to see and how it might be captured. I don't know. I mean, it may be that within all valuations, there was some easy statement regarding, water, flooding, electricity use, which would then allow some capture of data back into the government. So trying to facilitate help the government, how they're going to get there and how they might then disseminate it, I think is part of the role of professional bodies like this to engage with the with the governments with solutions rather than just challenges to them.
Thank you very much, Ben. I think, Katie, and we have reached a very important part.
Mm-hmm.
We're approaching the closing of our webinar. We are really grateful for the questions that came. We're grateful for our presenters. They did an excellent job, and I think we are leaving here more informed than we came. I see that we have an address from the president of the association.
Yes.
Just before. So at this time, I'll invite Mr. Jermaine Williamson to address us.
Jermaine?
Or should we?
All right. It's time for.
I sorry about that. I wasn't a host or co-host, so I was unable to unmute myself. Thank you guys. Thank you, Dr. Spencer. Thank you, Ben Elder, Andrew and Katie. Very, very good job. Very good job. Very informative as well. I want to thank everyone for. I'm not doing the vote of thanks, actually. It's just a message from my desk. But I really appreciate the information shared. It's a bit new, but we are familiar with the terminologies, and it puts us in an advantageous position where we can start collecting this information and talking as a group how we can represent this in our reports and informing our clients, and that would put us in a, as I said, an advantageous position where we provide a fulsome advice to our clients. It's also something that is international, not just within our space. So if valuers external to our environment are involved in capturing this information and representing it in their reports, we write reports for international organizations, so we have to follow suit as well. So I think the information shared today is really good, and we appreciate that. Just to share with the ALEVS members, And I just wanted to just use this opportunity, considering that we have so much of you online, that we are actively working on our constitution. We have gone through and have an exposure draft, and that will be shared. The timeline for those sharing have been shared with the members. We really encourage your participation in this exercise because it's moving our association forward and strengthening our regulation of members. So really just look out for that. I thank everyone for tuning into this very, very, very topical issue. As you are aware, Jamaica is fast developing. We're seeing more and more skyscraper. So it was very timely that we well, I wouldn't say skyscraper, but high-rise developments. And it's very timely that we had this session. So we brought in these great minds to just give us overall view of what's happening and what is to come and what is actually taking place. And we are just finding our space as Jamaica in all of this to the benefit of not just our locals, but in the global space. So thanks again, Dr. Robinson. Thanks again, Mr. Elder. And thanks to our hosts, Kadian and Andrew, also the technical support in the background, Rochelle and team. So that's it from me. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you, Jermaine. And for those who may not be aware, Jermaine Williamson is the president of the Elevs Association. Thank you so much. Now, as much as he sounded as if he gave the vote of thanks, the real vote of thanks is supposed to be coming from Mrs. Dondrine Thyme. She is also a council member of Elevs. I welcome now Ms. Thyme to the platform.
Good evening, everyone.
Hi, Dondrine.
Hi, Stephen. It has been such an honor to be a part of this wonderful event. Our webinar would not have been a success without the help of our two speakers, Dr. Robinson and Mr. Elder, who committed their time and effort to share their wealth of knowledge with us while opening to the learning about the nuances of the Caribbean and Jamaica specifically. Our moderators have skillfully used their unique experience to help us contextualize the information and to help to engendering critical reflection and application to the various fields. And for this, we say thank you. To our sponsors who came on board and lend their financial and other support to this initiative, we are truly grateful. And these sponsors are Lucy Caribbean, Alison Peter and Associates, A.S. James and Associates, Eastern Douglas Consultants Limited. Sorry. Eastern Douglas Consultant Limited, OS Property Services, TAS Property Appraisal, RAN Real Estate and Valuation Company Limited, KB Realty, SFR Realty, JCI Property Solutions, and Levi Property Services. To the organizing team, this webinar has been in the making for a while. And despite the various changes and challenges, you have shown what it is to be resilient. And we are very thankful. To those who provided much feedback, on the curriculum, and to those who have accredited same, we also would like to say sincere thanks. We'd like to say a special thank you to Mr. Ben Elder, Dr. Spencer Robinson, and Mr. Michael Zuri for their comments and their feedback. In terms of the creation of this webinar, or the creators of this webinar, we'd like to thank Mrs. Rochelle Tanner Miller, Dr. Tina Beal, and Ms. Amanda McCullough for their work. Finally, to all our registrants and attendees, we are happy you could join us. For many, ESG might be an unfamiliar term, and we are prepared ourselves for more involvement in the global landscape and for more active role in protecting our environment while ensuring the physical and economic development. We hope you have received some useful information from which to continue your journey. Thank you in advance. Thank you once more. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much, Ms. Syme. And in closing, I don't know if Andrew has anything to say.
Well, I want to say it was a privilege to have served in this capacity. And we look forward to more great things coming out of LLs. And we have truly been informed this afternoon as it relates to ESG and where the world is going. And we are in a global marketplace. As we are participants in this global marketplace, we are moving with the times and keeping abreast of the happenings. And likewise, I'm sure others will keep our members abreast of what changes are coming and what changes are taking place. Thank you. It was a pleasure assisting you, Mrs. Arthur Spinell.
The partnership is appreciated, and thank you all. My only bit in closing is saying thanks again. And given the topic that we discussed today, I can only say, let's make Jamaica the place of choice to live, work, raise families, and do business. Have a great evening. Bye-bye. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Ben.